Wichamar, shwi area crossok. Artenia Shunla, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Walk the Crossroads. This is your host here, Padraig Og, and we are going to be discussing the inspirations today behind the Oak Cross Metaverse project. Now, I would like to begin to say that as of the last 2 weeks, we have released the first chapter, the prologue, and the second chapter of Walk Between Shadows, the story of Nyla Clarkson, set right here in Whatcom County. If you haven't had time to check it out, there is a link down in the comments for our podcast today. Now, let's move on and discuss the basis of the inspiration behind Oak Cross. Oak Cross itself, the name, comes from a reference of the ancient reverence that many peoples had for hardwoods, or trees in general. Many Native American tribes revered trees to a distinct nature. The Salishan peoples actually made a lot of their clothing out of local cedar, and the peoples of Japan considered one of the cedars to be a holy aspect of the dances of the Miko, the shrine maidens. In ancient Celtic societies, the oak was the center of the world and actually linked our world to the mountains below, or the other world. For the Norse, it was the ash, the birch, and the oak. Trees have held a significant aspect of holiness in the place for many of us throughout time, and that is one reason that we call this project the Oak Cross. Now, let's move back a bit and discuss the inspiration behind Oak Cross. Oak Cross itself is the result of well over 10 years of work on various projects that have culminated in the current metaverse. I'd like to say that the current metaverse is not the first one I've created. In fact, I've created other ones before this. I once tried to unite many different roleplay storylines I had on Gaia Online with my friends Zin, Kage, Pyro Insane, Cyrus, and a few others. We, in fact, had up to 2 to 3 years of great roleplay on that site, and we created many awesome storylines. However, as times move on, we grew apart, and we still roleplay to a degree. Zen and I are still great friends. That's my friend Jordan Varjathy. And we are planning on launching our future online endeavor known as Das Wird in the future once we finish up work and I finish up getting my publishing degree. Now, the original storyline that began all of this was a random little roleplay thread on Gaia Online. For those of you who don't know it, that's a anime fandom site with its own avatars and little dinkly-doos. And I began a story known as The Legacy of Abaddon, set in a world of Abaddon, not to be confused with the demonic prince of the Nine Circles in Dante's Inferno, but a land filled with various races, including elves, dwarves, and other things, and flying races too. This was a very interesting, expansive world, not the very first I've ever created, but the first I ever did unleash upon the internet that led me to role-playing with a group of friends, and actually DMing with a group of friends. After this, I began role-playing in Dungeons & Dragons and White Wolf works, most specifically Changeling the Lost, Werewolf, The Forsaken, and just good old-fashioned World of Darkness. I even have ran a few Numenera campaigns. But back to the Legacy of Abaddon. Legacy of Abaddon was the first of many storylines that we did on Gaia that led us to well over 89 pages in just one thread alone. We eventually bought our very first guild. This is when the guild system was introduced to Gaia, so that we were actually able to roleplay our own stories. I introduced a mecha universe, a Celtic Fae universe, and a few other things. And after a while, we drifted apart. I started playing online games, and from there, I became heavily involved in World of Warcraft, which had no roleplay, but was a great experience of management and understanding administration. But it was really the launch of Guild Wars, the game I still love to this day, that I really ventured into roleplay on. And it was there that I founded a guild known as Whispers in the Darkness. Now, WOTD, as we called it, ran for about a year or so, and then it merged with 2-3 other guilds to form a mega guild called Shattered Eloquence. Shattered Eloquence, or RON, was a non-canon guild. For those of you who don't know what that means, it means we really didn't follow the canon of the game. We roleplayed with each other. I met many good long-standing friends there, including my friend Garen Failblood, or Joe as we call him. I haven't seen him in a while, but he is still a good friend of mine, and a few others. And we were together for well over a year. We eventually broke apart over disagreements, but that entire experience really got me to understand content, storytelling, but also creating consistent content, and also creating a brand, a sense of identity within the community. After RON, I then went on to found the infamous Ashenfold Cartel, but between that and Shattered Eloquence, I ran a few websites, the biggest one being a group called Binding Attrition, which was a body horror storyline focused upon the loss of one's humanity, and also had like a kind of a Yakuza feeling to it too. It was not for children, let's just say that, but it was a very interesting, fun storyline, and it again brought me to a lot of the friends I know today. That was my first endeavor directly with Zen. It was fantastic. We then went on to create the storyline roleplay forum known as The Sundered Way, which is the current incarnation that eventually became Altair. That's where we created Altair, we created the basis of the She, and we created the basis of what Oak Cross would become. After that, there was a few other boards, such as Epiphany Wired, which influenced a lot of what Land in the Stars is, and also a game called, sorry for the pause there, the next game after that was called Tides of Valhalla. That got me really into researching, actually understanding the group I'm creating a game for. Plus, it also helped me understand mythology and culture more efficiently. And then there was a game that never really got off the ground, but had a really good meshing of mythology, and that was Under Heaven. It was a kind of a mesh of Korean, Mongolian, Chinese, and Japanese mythology in a land called Nara. Now, all of these inspirations stem back from a sort of ethical mix that I learned in my experiences in Ireland and also back in college. I did have many great experiences in high school, but I grew up in kind of a white bread section of Whatcom County. Except for the local native reservation, I wasn't a very worldly person. It wasn't until I officially went to Ireland and also ventured to the Bahamas with my family that I really started to understand how diverse humanity is as a species. And after I came out of college, I really started venturing into understanding a lot of the aspects that I tell today. And the Amazon novels were written specifically during the last years or so of college, and that is why a lot of people will notice that there are references to the beginning of the Syrian Civil War, aspects referencing even honor killing, which was kind of a big discussion back then. We were discussing how women are treated in certain cultures and how other cultures look at things. And one of the things we studied heavily when I first went into anthropology was, in fact, honor killing. I apologize for the macabre discussion there, but it is an example of how my learning has directly influenced my writing. So, to kind of give this a bit more direction, let's discuss specifically how Ireland affected my writing. Ireland was the first time I was completely on my own. I had no member of my family there for a month. I was there I was completely alone, and I really just got to experience something without any sort of rose-colored glasses, except for, being the tourist living. Well, I wasn't a tourist, I was a college student, but living on my own with a roommate from another country. So that was completely eye-opening. I then, with my family, we ventured across parts of Ireland, but the fact that I was actually living in a country where English was the majority native language, but also had its own indigenous language, reminded me a lot of where I was living and how the local Lummies and the Nooksack had to deal with their language, maintaining it, compared to English and even Spanish coming in. And in Ireland, they have English, and then they have Slavic languages coming with Slavic, Eastern European immigrants, such as mostly Polish, but which are not to be confused with Slavic. You call them Balts. You never want to confuse them for Eastern Slavic peoples. And then also a lot of Ukrainians. This was well before the Ukrainian Civil War that's going on right now, but you could feel the influences. They would walk into a McDonald's and there would be Polish and English on the menu. That's kind of the extent of the immigrant population over there, and it was a different feeling. Here in the United States, we often, if you don't live in an area that is racially diverse, which mine is, it's just not as racially diverse as areas like Seattle or Vancouver. It's much more white bread because of the large amount of farms out here, but also the large contingent of settlers we have. We have Bellingham, but most of our towns are quite, monocultural. So once I went out to other countries which were experiencing multiculturalism, but it wasn't based upon necessarily racially diverse immigrants, but also culturally diverse immigrants, it really gave a sense of how much otherness, or the lack of understanding other people, that I had come to really have. And this is coming from someone who has a mother that is effectively one of the most diverse individuals I know. Not to mention my father has gone all over the place, has been a fisherman. So I have very, very open-minded, liberal-minded parents, and yet here I am really understanding my privilege when I went to other countries and sat back and went, I really don't know what's going on here. So that eye-opening moment, which got rid of a lot of the teenage self-importance and arrogance I had, not really, but worked upon it, was the major influence. Not to mention learning another language that was completely out of what I had understanding. I mean, here in America, we kind of get a sense of what Spanish is, but Gaelic has a completely different structure from how things are worded. They put the verb first, then the subject, then the object. For an English speaker, that's kind of like, that's heresy. We don't do that. So that really had me venturing more into understanding how language shapes how people think. And it was Irish that made me become a linguist, which then pushed me even further into understanding how different everybody is. And the thing about this is that my books, my writings, even my fantastical stuff is about real-world problems. It's I have a book series which is sitting on my computer, and it is influenced by colonization. It's about a story of a girl who becomes a living weapon, but the backdrop of it is imperialist colonization, and how we have these pseudo-Anglo-Saxon peoples effectively taking over another country. They get access to its land so they can grow food, so they can fight other invaders. It's an example of globalization and how groups of people make decisions not based upon, they hate people, but because there are goals that they can achieve without conquering people, without getting certain resources, that has influenced wars in the past. The Amazon novels deal with national identity, with a lack of being recognized. There are peoples today who don't have their own country. The Kurds are the best example. They're one of the most popular groups out there when it comes to an individual ethnic group that doesn't have its own nation. So the Amazons deal with that specifically, but also how people like the Israelis might think with a group that's gone through so much turmoil, and then people wonder why they're so militant in the modern day. So that's why I wrote the Amazon novels, to give kind of an idea about how a lot of these things we see in the media are actually much more complicated and diverse than what we really perceive. And it was really that, and also how Europe is displayed in American media versus how European media and actually living in Europe are, really got me to understand just how tinted those rose-colored glasses are. So, and also the language influences allowed me to start developing my own languages. It was how I started working on the Amazon language. It's how I started working on the language called Ed Inchal, which will reappear in Land of the Stars as a gutter tongue, or also the infamous Elder tongue. So, I would say right now, my major real-world influences are going to be, diversity is probably the most obvious. I want to write characters that are diverse. I want to write characters that are people. So I'm not putting a character in for the sake of having a token character. I'm writing a character to challenge myself to, one, to understand how people think, to go out and talk to people from groups that are not, Irish, Anglo, white people, to understand how these people think, to also broaden my horizons as a writer. It's a challenge to myself. I'm also writing characters of different sexual orientations, asexual characters, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual. I'm covering all of this because this is something that we often don't see in heteronormative storylines. We often put girl, guy, or girl, guy. I mean, I'm saying this because if you really think about it, guys, even when we're doing heterosexual relationships, we generally still stick, homosexual relationships, we still stick within the binary. So by opening it up, there's a lot more story to be there. There's a lot more possibility of emotion. There's a lot more openness. There's a lot more direction I can take as a writer. I'm not going to be tied down genre or a specific category of media. Now, when it comes to this, what I mean by is that if I were to write a story with a transgender main character, a lot of the time my character would cause, if I were to publish this on the mainstream, one, I'd either be told to change the character because the publisher might tell me people wouldn't understand the character's identity or understand their relationships or understand who they are. I would be told I would probably have to change who they are in general, make them a girl or a guy, bring them back to the binary. Or I would have to go to a publisher that specifically was focused upon transgender stories or LGBTQI stories. I don't want to be tied down to that. I want to be able to create stories that are just open. I want to have diversity, not for the sake of diversity, but to be able to just write stories that allow me to challenge my understanding and force me to research and to understand, to comprehend a viewpoint I may never have thought of. And I think this is the very reason why in a lot of my books I take time to not only sit down and think about something, but I'll set aside a chapter and I will jump from the character but also to the culture they live in. I mean, I understand how Amazons look and not only how their gender roles are structured, but also how they view a lot of the modern day. Like, for example, their religion is based upon freedom. It's about free will. So they take the concept of the loss of free will or taking free will to be the greatest sin ever. So a lot of their words, but a lot of their violent reactions or even just their ill reactions towards certain decisions or actions by other people tend to be based upon, did you take that person's free will? Did you break them as an individual? Did you hurt them? Did you kidnap them? And in fact, they have a lot of vile words and a lot of vile concepts about people who simply, just remove free will. And it's a very open-minded concept, but it's not in weakness. They place the onus of the loss of free will on the taker of free will, not on the people who lose free will. In The Land and the Stars, I have a race that are effectively imperialistic, clannish arseholes. I say this in a manner of, this is a race known as the Feyre. They've built all this great stuff. They founded 3 main empires. They have fought valiant battles, but just like the real world, they're the group in power, and they don't treat everybody else the best. This is a world where you have ethnic groups that disagree with each other, just like right now. Look at the ethnic Russians and the Ukrainians. They're disagreeing over, their disagreement stems in part to a law passed by the non-Yankovic parliament, which removed Russian as an official language. This kind of thing starts off wars on a various degrees. So in my writing, I try to cover this because this is how the real world works. People make decisions based upon things that in one society we may consider completely, I would say at the extreme, we would consider it stupid. But in other cases, we don't even think about it. I mean, we have people in the middle of Africa who think that the U.S. is spreading Ebola because someone created Ebola-chan on the internet. This is a thing. So this is an example of not only misinformation, but a lack of understanding that occurs between cultures that I try to cover in my books. I also try a lot of the times to do what Ursula Le Guin did in her Earthsea novels. She deconstructed the typical good people come from Western Eurocentric society, bad people come from proto-Middle Eastern or Asian or African or even Norse societies. I did the flip. She did the flip, I mean. I try to do the same, except I don't make anyone good. Everybody has, it's kind of a Song of Ice and Fire thing, people. Everybody has a agenda. Everybody thinks they're right to a degree. Some people are outright bad, like the Guagara, the evil vampire guy who's from Land of the Stars, or a villain present in Walk Between Shadows, but there is still an agenda, there is still a goal that these individuals and groups want to achieve. And it's this grayness that I try to bring out in my books. I don't really like black and white morality. I think black and white morality is good. At the same time, I tend to prefer white morality only in instances when I really want to be clear about something I feel strong about, such as human trafficking. In human trafficking, I'm very black and white. The people that traffic other people are bad people. They can be redeemed, but if they don't, they're bad people. You'll see this in the Amazon books. Abusers are bad people. I do this mostly because I have very emotional reactions to these instances. I don't like people who abuse other people. It's something I utterly despise, and I be honest, it's probably one of the few things that bleed out into my writing, if no one has seen it. Probably not, because these books aren't out yet. So, on to just discussing more of how this applies to everything. I don't want my books to be a soapbox. They're not meant to preach. I don't want my stories to preach, to tell you how to think. What I want them to do is to naturally present a point of view so that people can read it and go, huh, it's interesting. I don't want this to be like some big discussion like what we're seeing right now with Shades of Grey or Twilight, or even the political inspirations that are occurring behind Mockingjay and any other book related to Hunger Games. And I would like to say that one of the areas I'm really stemming towards when it comes to inspiration of writing, or just what I want to aim for, is Millennium Trilogy. The Millennium Trilogy, in a lot of cases, really smacks you in the face with its ethics, but also presents a lot of characters which are not generally, I would say, what you're going to see as the typical main character in a lot of books in the mainstream storyline. We have Lisbeth Salander, a small, diminutive girl with borderline Asperger's, who really has a problem understanding other people, but effectively is this genius hacking hero who takes down really bad people, does really violent things to people, goes through a lot of really bad things, but she doesn't walk out the victim. She walks out as this completely transformed individual, and she gets a better life for it. After all the crap she goes through, she gets a better life, or a better semblance of life. She gets a grip against all the things that have hit her, and that is the kind of story I want to tell. I want to see individuals who may not be the best people, who may not be perfect people, but are able to rise above. Not always, but to at least make a good challenge of it. So, as one of my characters likes to say, and as something I like to say, I'm not a dragon slayer. I might be what Kosh says from Babylon 5, I slay legends, but I don't slay dragons. It will become an understandable trope once I eventually get to more of my writing, but it's a line from Arrowchild, which makes sense in the context of what I'm saying, but I will keep it under wraps because sadly it's deep in the book and it's a huge spoiler. Anyway, thank you for listening in today. I understand I ramble a bit on these. I'm working on that. But thank you for your support, and I will see you all next time here on Walk the Crossroads, when we will start talking a bit more about specific universes rather than just me, the writer. Anyway, everybody, Vehen Shush, farewell from the lands of Altair, and don't forget to walk the crossroads.